And so we continue with part 2 of like a million, looking at the impacts of World War II in Europe. Learning outcomes are the same as previous, just kind of understanding the social political impacts that this had in Europe and how it's going to essentially change the development of these regions. And of course, during this time, after the Yalta Conference, war continued in Europe, and in the summer we get the Potsdam Conference. Now, I know y'all have like these amazing powers of observation. And because y'all have these amazing powers of observation, you should see that one of the three dudes is not the same as the previous picture. So by the time we get to August, the president of the U.S., Roosevelt, has died, and his vice president, Truman, becomes president. And Truman is a different dude from Roosevelt, different outlook, anti-communist, so on and so forth. And so we start seeing the breakdown of the wartime alliance. All right, so from this Potsdam Conference, we have the Potsdam Agreement and confirmation of the treatment of Germany. So this idea of denazification, demilitarization, occupation of Germany, and reparations. So this was essentially a confirmation of what had been discussed in Yalta. And so they were going to treat Germany as a single unit. So the idea was actually to create a unified German state. That's not what happens, but in Potsdam, what they had agreed was that Germany was to be treated as a single unit, and with these different zones of occupation. That is, there's going to be establishment of a democracy. There's going to be disarmament, demilitarization, and denazification. So all of those things were supposed to happen for Germany. And they agreed that they would reduce and or destroy German heavy industry with war potential. So the idea here was in the demilitarization of Germany, it wasn't just to remove, reduce, destroy Germany's like Air Force and Navy and Army, but the idea was to prevent Germany from even developing the potential to remilitarize. So this is their attempt to look at what they had done wrong at the end of World War I that allowed a militarily strong Germany to rise and prevent that from happening. And the German economy was to be restructured toward farming and light industry. So complete demilitarization and essentially creating a pacifist Germany. And the difference between heavy industry and light industry, heavy industry includes things like steel, train, tanks, planes, automobiles, because a lot of the automobile companies like Mercedes were involved in the creation of the planes and stuff. So it's relatively easy to turn any heavy industry into a military industry. This is what the U.S. did during World War II to provide arms, and this is essentially what Germany did towards World War II. And light industry is stuff like, I don't know, canning tomatoes. It's really hard to turn canning tomatoes into making airplanes. So things like this, like light industry is often production of consumer goods. So, flip-flops. Not going to make a lot of tanks from flip-flops. In terms of reparations, the Soviet Union was also supposed to get 10% of the industrial capacity from the U.S. and the British occupied areas. So essentially, a third of Germany was to be occupied by the Soviet Union. And then because of the heavy amount of damage that the Soviet Union took during World War II, the idea is the monetary good, whatever Germany was able to produce, 10% of it would go towards the Soviet Union to kind of help her rebuild. there was going to be a destruction and or apportioning of the German Navy. So essentially destroy some stuff, especially things like, I guess, the U-boats, but the ships and things that could be used would actually be absorbed into other countries' navies. They did this at the end of World War I as well. The Soviet Union was to receive portions of East Prussia. So again, an expansion outward, which meant, of course, that the Germans living in East Prussia would be forcibly removed. And this also meant that they're going to shift the borders of Poland. And there's going to be the trying of the war criminals, and this was the Nuremberg trials. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And Austria would pay no reparations. So basically, Austria would pay no reparations to Britain and the U.S. Essentially, they decided to treat Austria as a minor partner and not a willing participant in the stuff that Germany did. And as, yes, they were fighting, but not a willing participant, they're not going to be as heavily punished. And there is the recognition of the Soviet puppet state in Poland, and the borders were to be decided with the final peace treaty. And that essentially came until 1990. So Poland was occupied until 1990. And Poland's government remained in exile until this time. By the time we get to this point, the U.S. is kind of exhausted, and with this war, Britain is tapped out, and all of Europe is pretty much tapped out. There's very little left to give. And they recognize that even though this was essentially a betrayal of Poland, a complete betrayal of what Britain promised Poland at the beginning of World War I, or before World War I began, they were in no position to fight the Soviet Union about this. And we're going to form democratic governments in Italy, Bulgaria, Finland, Hungary, Romania, and these states would also join the UN. Of those, things worked out for Italy and Finland. And there was going to be an orderly transfer of German populations. Essentially, anyone who is ethnically German is going to be forced to move out of Eastern Europe. So they don't want another crisis like the Sudetenlands. So the Germans living in the Sudetenlands were forced to move. East Prussia is going to, or portions of East Prussia are going to the Soviet Union. Those Germans would be forced to move. They're going to redraw Poland's borders and shift Poland's borders westward. And the Germans living in those areas are going to have to move. And so they agreed that there would be an orderly transfer of these people. So one of the things that they agreed upon at the Potsdam Conference and announced in the Potsdam Agreement was the idea of this Council of Foreign Ministers. And so the council was supposed to be made up of the foreign ministers of the UK, the Soviet Union, China, France, and the United States. And the idea is that this group would meet from time to time. And they're going to have their first meeting in September of that year, so almost immediately after the Potsdam Conference. And what they were supposed to do, the most important thing, was to draw up the treaties and the settlements of ending World War II, and basically redraw the borders of these countries. And so they were supposed to draw up the peace treaties with Italy, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Finland. And basically they were supposed to sort of decide the territorial issues. And so this was supposed to be a group of experts, essentially. However, at the first meeting, the U.S. and the Soviet Union could not agree over what the occupation of Japan would look like. There's a big difference between what was happening out in the Pacific, because the only real two actors out there Yes, Australia got bombed. But the only two real actors out there um, are the US and the Soviet Union. Whereas in Europe, you have sort of like Britain and France mitigating things, right? And so there's just this disagreement about what Japan is going to look like. And some historians say that the beginnings of the Cold War began at the Potsdam Conference. And so because you see here this kind of, because of the disagreement between these two powers that are essentially going to be the two spheres influence of the Cold War, and you see this sort of like clear drawing and disagreement about what's going to happen. And so, therefore, the agreement or the treaty with Austria didn't come to pass until 1955, so 10 years after World War II ended. And then the final treaty for Germany, because, of course, we have this Cold War and East Germany, West Germany, didn't come into practice, didn't happen until 1990. That is, until there was a unified Germany to actually treat with. Part of the Potsdam Conference was this Potsdam Declaration. And the Potsdam Agreement deals with Europe, and the Potsdam Declaration deals with Japan. And I'm not going to discuss it too much here because we'll look at it in greater detail when we look at the impacts of World War II in Asia. But to understand that this Potsdam Declaration was part of this same meeting, just different actors and different goals.